Hi, folks. Okay, so we're going to talk about the cycles of matter today. This is the last week of notes before the project, and the last one in Unit 2. So, really quick, I want you to try and answer this question. So these buildings on the top right-hand side, they are part of a research facility located in Arizona called Biosphere 2. Okay, the whole point of these is it's basically a sealed place where scientists can study Earth's ecosystems to understand carbon and oxygen cycles, try and solve climate change. Okay, now on September 26, 1991, 8 research scientists began a 2-year adventure where they lived inside the Biosphere 2. Okay, they were completely sealed off from the outside environment to simulate this living in a closed system. But the results in the experiment were actually really unexpected. The plants and animals inside the biosphere started to die. Okay, and the scientists were running out of food, oxygen, and they had increasing carbon dioxide levels, so they were finding it harder to breathe. Now, why do you think that happened? Okay, why did these problems develop in the biosphere too, like low oxygen levels, increasing carbon dioxide levels? And, after we answer why did they happen, how would you solve that problem? So take a moment, you can pause the video to answer this question. So hopefully you paused it, you answered the question in your own words. My response is that something about the cycles of matter in the building were thrown out of balance by adding the scientists. Before the scientists went in, the ecosystem was balanced, but once they added people with carbon dioxide needs or oxygen needs who were producing carbon dioxide and eating and all of those things, suddenly the balance was thrown off. Okay, and until that balance is restored, the system wouldn't function properly. So, how you could solve these problems, you could, like add more plants, add more food sources, more water, more resources to handle the addition of scientists. So when we're talking about the biosphere, okay, we're talking about recycling matter because on Earth we have this atmosphere that protects us, right? And it keeps a bunch of stuff in, like matter, like water and air and oxygen and all of those things, and they're trapped inside the Earth with us. Sunlight is the only thing that comes from outside, and it's that source of energy for the Earth, okay? But it only flows one way, right? It doesn't leave. Now, matter is recycled between and within ecosystems. We call these biogeochemical cycles. Bio meaning life, geo meaning earth, chemical meaning chemical, okay? So these are all the biological, geological, and chemical aspects of the biosphere, and they all cycle and basically recycle or refresh all of the things we need to live. It passes elements, chemical compounds, and matter from one organism to another or from one part of the biosphere to another to provide this exchange. Now, I want you to answer this question. When solar radiation enters Earth's atmosphere, about 23% is absorbed in the atmosphere and 48% is absorbed at the surface. The rest is reflected back into space. Okay? So if energy is conserved, what percent of solar energy would be reflected back into space? Okay? So put the box around the correct answer. How much do you think would get reflected back into space? If 23 goes to the atmosphere, 48 goes to the surface. And if you answer 29%, you are correct. So we take 23 plus 48, and then we subtract that from 100% to find 29%. Now, matter cycles through the many Earth layers. So we're going to call them different things. There's the atmosphere, which is the thing at the surface, okay, that's the top of the Earth that protects us. The geosphere, which is basically everything from the ground below, okay, so it's everything ground Earth related. Hydrosphere, which is everything water related on our planet. And biosphere, which is everything really that's living and non-living. The anthrosphere is everywhere that the humans live. Okay, anthro means human, so anthrosphere is pretty much everything within human life or the human world. Now, very small amounts of matter are lost to space from the top of the atmosphere. Pretty much everything else stays inside. So we consider the Earth a closed system because nothing really leaves or comes. Well, sunlight comes in, but nothing else really comes in or leaves. So if you look right here at this picture, an open system is something where like sunlight will go into the water and carbon dioxide will leave the water. So the water itself is an open system. This ecosystem is open. A closed system is where something can't come in and leave. Now I want you to go ahead and double click in these boxes to correctly fill the blanks with these 4 words. So basically one answer in each box. You can use the GIF at the right to help you answer the question. Energy from the sun fuels the cycling of matter. For example, water in the blank evaporates to the blank. Water returns to the Earth's surface or the blank as precipitation. Organisms in the blank use water to carry out cell processes. So use the words at the bottom in the word box to fill in the blanks. Okay, so hopefully you got the correct answers. Water in the hydrosphere evaporates to the atmosphere. It returns to Earth's surface or the geosphere as precipitation. And then organisms in the biosphere use water to carry out our cell processes. Now remember, the law of conservation of matter. So I talked about this last time when we were talking about how matter can't be created or destroyed. Matter is simply transformed from one form to another. Okay, it's assembled into things like living tissue, like your body, or it's passed out of the body as waste products. Okay, so we were talking about this when we were talking about food webs and pyramid models, where energy was passed from one organism to another. So if we think about it in a different way, right? You're breathing the same oxygen that the dinosaurs were breathing millions of years ago. It's just recycled. And you're also drinking the same water that they were peeing and, drinking and peeing. So everything is recycled, okay? All of the stuff that's currently here today existed millions and billions of years ago, from the time it was first formed to today. Now, the water cycle is also known as the hydrologic cycle, okay? There are 4 steps in the water cycle. There's evaporation, which is where liquid turns into gas. Transpiration, where water enters the atmosphere by evaporating from the leaves of plants. Then there's condensation, where the evaporated air begins to become thicker and colder, and it condenses into tiny frozen droplets that form clouds. And then it precipitates, where we get rain, snow, hail, sleet. Basically, water becomes heavy enough to return to Earth. Okay, and I want to talk really quickly about the reservoir versus a process. So a reservoir is a location where cycling matter is stored, like a lake or an ocean, okay, or even a cloud. It's a place where water is held. And then a process moves matter between reservoirs. So precipitation, for example, moves water from the clouds to the ground. Okay. Infiltration, this process of moving water or percolation is another word for it, where it moves water downhill into the ocean. That's a process because it's moving the water from one place to another. Okay. So a reservoir and a process, they can exist in other cycles of matter, not just the water cycle. It's just really easy to picture it with the water cycle. Now, which of these is a reservoir and which of these is a process? So I want you to move the circles or the ovals over the reservoir process for each of the items. So is a cloud a reservoir or a process? Is precipitation a reservoir or a process? Evaporation? Freshwater lake. So clouds are reservoirs, and so are freshwater lakes. They're places to store water. Precipitation and evaporation are processes. Okay, they move water from, like in precipitation case, from the cloud to the lake, and evaporation from the lake to the cloud. Okay. Now, if the total amount of water on Earth does not change, right? We're drinking the same water that the dinosaurs drank. So, why are people around the world worried about running out of fresh drinking water? Why do we care? Well, the reason is because we only have so much drinking water at a time. It takes time for water to go through this cycle, okay? And because we have so many people on the planet, what's happening is that everybody needs drinking water, but there's only a limited amount of drinking water available at any given time. Yes, it recycles, it'll come back, But if somebody needs to have a drink right now, they need water, like they can't wait a month for the water to recycle or years for the water to recycle. They need it now. So the problem is that with our population continuously getting bigger and bigger, and the amount of fresh water decreasing, we don't really have enough for everybody to drink right now. And even if it takes time, the problem is it takes time to recycle this water, so we can't replenish it right away. So let's talk about the oxygen cycle. The oxygen cycle cycles through our planet, right? It moves oxygen passing from the atmosphere to the plants, the animals, to back again. We talked about this when we were talking about photosynthesis and cellular respiration, right? How oxygen goes gets produced by the plants and then comes to us, and we inhale it and we process it into carbon dioxide and back again. Now we find oxygen molecules, so oxygen the element, in things like carbon dioxide, oxygen gas, ozone, which is O3, it's three oxygen molecules together, nitrogen oxides, water, bicarbonate, so many different things are found in nature that have oxygen. So I want you to take a moment and move the boxes. So you're just going to click and drag them over to where they go. Where does oxygen and carbon dioxide go? Where does cellular respiration and photosynthesis go? And hopefully you answered this correctly. The photosynthesis goes with the tree. Cell res goes with the human. We take in oxygen and we produce carbon dioxide. Okay, and plants take in carbon dioxide and they produce oxygen. So that is the cycle. Now, oxygen is taken in by our bodies, used to make every type of biological molecule, like carbohydrates, fats, proteins, everything. Okay, so it's necessary for us to live. All the cycles of Earth really interact with each other. Okay, that's the thing. It's not like we'll talk about them in isolation. Like we talk about it as, oh, this is the oxygen cycle. Oh, this is the water cycle. But really, they all interact. Okay, the oxygen cycle is closely tied with the carbon cycle. We need water involved in the oxygen cycle in order to oxygen carbon to produce more oxygen, right, through photosynthesis. Um, but the water cycle is connected to it. And the nitrogen and the phosphorus cycles also have a part to play. And they use oxygen, they use, like they're involved in our oxygen cycle. So, they all connect. This kind of picture shows how the water cycle and the carbon cycle kind of work together. Like we got this water cycle happening right here, this carbon cycle, and it all kind of combines with the humans and our resources. Now, the nitrogen cycle is about 78% of the Earth's atmosphere. Okay, nitrogen is about 78%. So it actually fills up quite a lot of our atmosphere. Now, organisms need it in a different form to use it. We can't just breathe in nitrogen gas and call it a day. We need to basically convert nitrogen into things like ammonia, nitrate, nitrite, and other kinds of chemicals that organisms can use because we use nitrogen in our proteins. Okay, it's essential for our proteins and amino acids. Without nitrogen, we wouldn't be able to live. Okay, now we have bacteria that do this fixing. Okay, they turn nitrogen into stuff we can use through a process called nitrogen fixation. Okay, they convert nitrogen gas in the air into ammonia, which is NH4. Now, some bacteria are aerobic and they do this with oxygen, and others are not. Some live in the ocean, some live on the roots of plants like beans and peas in little nodules on their roots, and some just live in the soil. Okay, but basically, these bacteria, wherever they live, they convert nitrogen gas into ammonia, and then other bacteria convert the ammonia into ammonium, and then that into nitrite, and then that into nitrate. Basically, it's several different steps to get us to a form that plants can use. Okay. Now, what are the similarities and the differences between the nitrogen and oxygen cycles? So, what's the same and what's different? So, we just talked about the oxygen cycle, right? It was, photosynthesis replenishing that oxygen cycle. And here is a picture of the nitrogen cycle, okay? So you can see that the atmospheric nitrogen goes through nitrogen fixation. It goes through all these steps to turn into all these different things. And then it gets used and pulled into the producer cycle that goes to consumers and decomposers, and it goes through this process. And then eventually the nitrates get basically turned back into nitrogen gas, okay? So how is that similar to the oxygen cycle? How is it different? So both these are large-scale cycles. That's what they have in common. They both move molecules through organisms, and organisms are involved in both cycles. Oxygen is picked up and used as is, okay, as oxygen gas, but nitrogen has to be fixed to be used. So that's the main difference. They're both the similarities that they're both large-scale molecules. They go through these big cycles. They're involved, and they're necessary in both. Oxygen is used in both cycles, but in terms of the differences, oxygen is used as is. Nitrogen must be fixed. And I just fixed the. Oh, hold on. Sorry, just fixed the oxygen is involved in both cycles. The word disappeared. Okay. So nitrogen cycle. Okay, what is the process? So nitrates are taken up by plants. Okay, through a process called assimilation. So the plants need nitrates in order to turn them into protein. Okay, they convert the nitrates into amino acids, into protein. They put it in their bodies, and then the consumers eat it. So that's how we get nitrogen and use it in our protein. Herbivores take up the nitrogen from plants. They eat it, put it in their bodies, and then we organisms, humans, other carnivores, we eat the herbivores and we get it from them. Or if they're an omnivore like us or an herbivore, we can eat plants and get it from them. Okay. Now, when we die, decomposers break down animal waste or detritus. Nitrogen is then returned to the soil. Okay, it's returned as ammonium. It's in this. The process is called ammonification. Okay, turning dead organic matter into ammonium, and then the soil gets filled with that. Okay, denitrification is the process where bacteria use nitrate as an oxygen source, and they release nitrogen gas as a waste product. So essentially, what happens is, there's this process where ammonium is turned into nitrates and then nitrates. Plants take it up, they add it to their bodies, it's consumed by animals, and then when we die, the decomposers turn it back into ammonium. Now that can return to this process where it gets turned into nitrites and nitrates, and then goes back into plants, or it can be turned into the nitrates can be broken down and turned into a nitrogen gas, and then it gets returned to the major cycle. Okay, so nitrogen can also be fixed through making fertilizer. So we do it artificially. We do what the bacteria do, and turn nitrogen gas into something that the plants can absorb. And also lightning. Interestingly enough, its energy breaks apart nitrogen gas in the atmosphere, and then because usually there's a thunderstorm involved, water mixes with that broken apart nitrogen gas and turns into nitrates. Okay. Now, once nitrogen is in the soil, it can be moved by water, and that means it can go from land to the bottom of lakes or swamps or oceans in a process called leaching. Okay. Now, here's the thing: why do we create fertilizer? Okay. So the thing is that farmers really want to grow better crops. Okay, and so we artificially create fertilizer, which is we discovered like a long time ago that when you put dead organisms or animal waste near your crops grow better. Okay, because all of that waste gets broken down by the bacteria and turned into nitrogen. And your plants want nitrogen and phosphorus, because we'll talk about phosphorus in a second, but they want nitrogen and they need that in order to grow better. So we make fertilizer, which is basically this artificial nitrogen, so that our plants grow better. Okay. Now, bacteria are microscopic organisms, but they're essential to life on Earth. How can the microscopic fixation of nitrogen have such a big impact on us? Why is it so big? So, if you think about it, microscopic bacteria are small, but they have a big impact because that impact gets passed up the trophozoite. Okay, the bacteria produce or make nitrogen or turn nitrogen into nitrates, and then our plants take them up. And the producers need that stuff in order to feed themselves, and then the consumers feed on them, and so on until everybody is satisfied. So the bacteria kind of fulfill that base job that is absolutely needed. So the nitrogen fixing bacteria live symbiotically. That means that they live hand in hand. They You scratch my back, I'll scratch your back, with certain types of plants, okay, like legumes, which are bean or pea plants. Now, there's something called rhizobia, which are bacteria that live on their root nodules. So on the roots, like here, okay, they have these nodules that develop on the roots, and inside those we have this bacteria, and the bacteria turn things like ammonium into nitrates and nitrites and all that kind of stuff, and they fix nitrogen gas into ammonia, and the plant can then absorb it. Okay, now most of this ammonia is actually not consumed or used by the plant. It's actually stored. Okay, it's stored until the plant dies. And then decomposers convert those ammonia molecules and release some of that nitrogen back into the atmosphere. Okay, but they mostly take it and they convert it once the plant is dead. Now, legumes are often planted and harvested as crops, right? We like beans. Okay, now when this happens, plants, however, are not left to decompose in soil. Okay, farmers find it more efficient to plant the legumes, let them grow, and then remove the whole plant from the ground and just keep it clean because it's cheaper to do that. Now, why is this a bad idea? Okay, so look at the above paragraph and answer why this might be a bad idea to not leave the plants in the soil. So the thing is that as we look in the second paragraph, right, the ammonia is kept by the plants in their bodies until the plant dies. And decomposers then will process the ammonia and release some of it into the atmosphere. Well, if we remove the plant, it means we're removing the biggest source of nitrogen in that plant. So if we left them in the ground and allowed them to decompose in the soil, we would return more nitrogen to the environment than if we were to plant the legumes, let them grow, and then remove them before they can decompose. All right, so let's talk phosphorus. Phosphorus is an important building block for ATP. Okay, remember that ATP, the P in ATP, that stands for phosphorus. Okay, we need ATP for our energy. It's the energy component of our cell. That's how our cell, it's the currency that our cell needs to operate. It's also used in DNA and the phospholipids, which is like the cell membrane. It's like this barrier that protects the cell and keeps the water inside. So without phosphorus, we would not exist. Okay, our bodies would just fall apart. Now, where does it come from? So in their natural environment, phosphorus is found in ocean sediment and rock. Okay, it's actually stored in those kinds of things: rock, ground, dirt, that kind of stuff. Now, weathering or erosion, so the process of wearing away at rock, turning rock into little pebbles or little bits and dust, these processes break down the rocks and they make that phosphorus available to animals and plants. When phosphorus ends up in the soil, the producers absorb it. So plants, they get it from the soil. And then we eat plants to get the phosphorus and put it in our bodies, and that's how we grow. Okay. Decomposers, when we die, return that phosphorus to the soil and the water. And if they harden and calcify, they can become rock again, or they can get moved to other organisms. Now, water moves phosphorus from land to the ocean, okay, through things like runoff and leaching. Leaching, remember, is that process of moving water or moving phosphorus or nitrogen from one place to another using water. Compounds that dissolve to phosphates are taken up by algae, and then the algae go through the process of the producer-consumer thing. Now, sedimentation is when some of those phosphates don't actually get used by plants and instead settle to the ocean floor, and it becomes phosphate rocks over the years, and then eventually they break down, they weather, they release the compounds back into the cycle. Humans, we like phosphate. Phosphate is another one of those things that we can put in fertilizer and make our plants grow really, really well. So we like to take those, mine those phosphate rocks and use them. So here's a picture of the phosphate process, right? We've got phosphate rocks, they weather all of it, or we mine it, and it leaches out, goes into the water as runoff, ends up in the ocean. It can dissolve and turn into sediment, or it can be excreted and used for organisms. It goes through the producer soil consumer cycle, all of that stuff. I want you to go ahead and move the check marks over the boxes where the statements are true. So phosphate flows from the atmosphere to the geosphere. Phosphorus is stored only in abiotic reservoirs. Weathering releases phosphate in rocks, or phosphate is taken up by producers in aquatic ecosystems. So if you answer the last two, that is correct. Phosphorus is not only stored in abiotic reservoirs, okay, living reservoirs can hold them too, and phosphate doesn't flow from the atmosphere to the geosphere, it goes the other way around, okay? It's mostly geosphere to hydrosphere, or geosphere to biosphere, all right? So carbon is the most, is in most chemical compounds that make up living things. So things like dead organic matter, plants, animals. We use it as carbon dioxide gas. We have oil and gas, like the fossil fuels. Okay, carbon is in everything. Producers remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere during photosynthesis, and they store it in their tissues. We then eat that carbon and we turn it back into CO2 as part of the process of making energy. Okay. Now, when organisms die, our matter becomes fossilized, or could become fossilized. And then our bodies are turned into fossil fuels over millions of years and tons of pressure beneath the Earth's surface. So this is not something that will renew anytime soon. Okay, we don't call this a renewable resource because it's not renewable within our lifetime or within millions of lifetimes. Okay, it takes millions of years, like 200 million years, for something like this to happen. Now, the fossil fuel process, or when it's turned into fossil fuels, it can store carbon long term in the biosphere and the geosphere. So it's actually super helpful for getting carbon out of the atmosphere, for getting carbon dioxide out. Now, the impact of these processes depends on the time scale and the rate at which they operate for the cycle. So, natural processes can take a few hundred years to make one cycle, compared to the geosphere, which is that fossil fuel thing, that can take millennia. Okay? So the natural process of like turning things over from photosynthesis to cellular respiration to organism to organism to organism, all of that can take a few hundred years. Okay? Now, what would the processes and the reservoirs of the carbon cycle, how would they change over time if we stop photosynthesis? So what would happen to these processes and the reservoirs if we just stopped photosynthesis? Well, without photosynthesis, carbon would build up in the atmosphere, and eventually there would be too much CO2 in the atmosphere, and we would suffocate to death. Okay? We need the plants to remove CO2. So that's kind of what's happening right now. You know, we don't have enough plants for removing CO2. We're kind of suffocating. Now, Easter Island was an island in the southeastern Pacific Ocean. Okay, it was first inhabited between 400 and 700 CE. A human colony grew quickly over the next 1,000 years, and they cut down forests for lumber, for building boats, for their homes, all those kinds of things. And the thing is that because it was an island, the forests were cleared faster than they could grow back. And eventually all the trees were gone, and all that was left was just this barren wasteland, if you will. Now, without wood for shelter or boats, the soil began to wash away and the animals lost all their homes. And eventually, the people that lived on Easter Island disappeared, leaving only a small population of people behind. So think about the effects that the human population had on Easter Island. They completely destroyed the ecosystem within 1,000 years. Something that might have taken millions of years to create was gone like that, the blink of an eye. And how did they change the island's natural cycling of matter and energy? Think about how the trees disappeared. So what would happen to the oxygen and the carbon dioxide cycles within this island? Now, since the 1800s, humans have extracted fossil fuels. We've used them to power our machines, cars, all the things. And in the process, we've released CO2 back into the atmosphere. Okay? Now, normally, carbon dioxide diffuses into the ocean, and it enters the carbon cycle there, and they go through this process. And oceans are carbon sinks. They can hold a lot of carbon. But the thing is that in recent years, like the last 40, 50 years or so, carbon dioxide levels have gotten so high that they began to destroy the cells of sea organisms in this process called ocean acidification. And it's actually bleaching the coral, it's killing the coral. So if you look at this picture right here, nice healthy shells become weaker and thinner until they break really easily. That's what happens in ocean acidification. Or in this picture, the coral was like bright red, it's all pretty, alive, and this is dead coral, bleached coral. Okay, and that's what happens with when we put too much carbon dioxide in the water. Atmospheric CO2 can also affect us. Okay, it's created air pollution. Things like burning gas and oil releases CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide, and all of that stuff together, the fossil fuel emissions plus sunlight makes smog. Okay, and we create ozone by mixing nitrogen dioxide and oxygen to make O3. This eats away at our atmosphere, and our atmosphere is what protects us from UV light. It prevents us from getting sick. Keeps our oxygen inside our planet, okay, so we can breathe. And smog is just generally harmful to us. It affects the eyes, the throat, our mucous membranes. A lot of people develop asthma or chest pain. We have increased risk of respiratory diseases like lung cancer, all of those things because we keep, like our smog is killing us. It's hurting us. Okay. The ozone has actually gone down since the EPA put in new rules saying that we have to limit how much ozone and smog and all that kind of stuff we put in the air. Now, increasing levels of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases also drive climate change. They are the biggest driver of climate change. So the inner core of the planet is just getting hotter. So what's happening is that the heat is getting trapped inside our planet, and the hotter it is, the more ACs we run, the more power we use to restore our the comfortable environment that we're used to, and that means we're releasing more and more CO2. So we're basically getting into the cycle where we're using up more energy because we're using up a lot of energy. And this is causing extreme weather patterns and changing seasonal patterns. So it doesn't mean that it's hot everywhere. It means that in some places it's hotter, some places colder, some places have more hurricanes or typhoons. Other places like the ice caps are melting and polar bears are dying because things aren't freezing like they used to. Now, the ecosystem is always limited by a single nutrient. The whole point is that one travel level shouldn't get too out of control. Okay. Now, the thing is that humans don't like it because it's hard to earn record profits for selling crops if there's a limit to how much your plants can produce without a certain nutrient. So farmers add fertilizers to their crops to boost productivity. So fertilizer contains nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Now, nitrogen is the limiting agent in most of the ocean, whereas phosphorus is the limiting agent in freshwater ecosystems. But basically, the idea is that we add fertilizer to our crops and they grow better. We make a lot more organisms. You can see that here by increasing the nutrient supply, our plants get exponentially bigger. Now, here's the thing, is that the way we farm basically allows fertilizer, or it basically makes the soil loose, okay? Because we use machines to tear up the earth, and that means we pull up weeds and we pull up plants. And then the soil is all loose. And I want you to think about what happens when you have a bunch of loose soil and then you toss some water onto it, okay? The water drags the soil with it and takes the soil wherever the water's going, okay? So what happens is that this fertilizer goes with the water and it runs off in the natural path that water flows to the oceans or to any kind of freshwater system. And it takes the nitrogen with it. And the thing is that while the nitrogen is great on our crops and giving us more food, it also gives more food to the algae. And the algae go nuts and they start to bloom and they, basically cover the ocean and they make other organisms sick. Now, farming causes that erosion, so that's that loose soil that I was talking about. Okay, it's the movement of rock, soil, or sand by wind or water. This moves pesticides, not just fertilizer, to the lakes, ponds, and oceans, and you can see that in this picture. Okay, you've got all this loose soil. Like even though you've got some plants, there's a lot of soil that's loose and it's running off with the water. So instead of running off clear water, we're running off all this dirty water that's dragging pesticides and fertilizer into natural ecosystems, and that causes problems with those ecosystems. So I want you to pick the box on the right and move it to the passage right here to put it over the select box in order to answer this question. Finish the sentence. So agricultural runoff can affect the overall health of an ecosystem. In the case of aquatic ecosystems, algae blooms and the bacteria that break down the dead algae can deplete the blank that fish and other organisms need to survive. Fish-eating birds and other animals are impacted because they rely on these organisms for food. So the algae, when it blooms, okay, it basically, and the bacteria then break down the dead algae. They deplete the oxygen the other fish need to survive. So that's basically what happens. Is when the algae blooms, it kind of covers the water, and then the gas exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen doesn't happen as efficiently. And the bacteria, like when the algae dies, then bacteria goes and breaks down the algae, and they use up oxygen in the process. But that means there's not enough oxygen for the fish. All right. So the other thing that we do to get at coal, gold, silicon, copper, other metals and rocks. So not just for making fossil fuels, but also for making your computers, your iPads, your phones. Like we mine silicon, we mine copper, we mine gold, we mine all of these other metals in order to create our technology or other things. In the process, we remove soil and any kind of vegetation or weeds or anything like that, exposing rock to air and water. And the thing is that once we've done that, now the soil is loose, okay? And the erosion process can move all of these nutrients, like from these rocks to the waterway, okay? So I want you to move the boxes to the right to complete the paragraph. You're going to move all the boxes. Both rock and bodies of water are considered a type of what in cycles of matter? When rock is exposed for mining, blank can readily transport nutrients from rock to aquatic ecosystems. Runoff that carries excessive nutrients can cause algal blooms, and the effects of blank can also increase the water pollution and clog waterways. So the first answer is reservoir. Okay, rock and bodies of water store nutrients. Water can move those nutrients from rock to aquatic ecosystems. And the effects of soil erosion also increase water pollution and can clog those waterways. Okay, and that is it for today. I apologize for the extremely long notes, but hopefully you learned something. And when you're done, please submit the notes and move on to the next activity. Thank you. Bye-bye.